You're watching the Neighbors and Newsroom Summit, building collaborations that better inform and engage South Jersey. This event is made possible by the Geraldine R. Foundation and from viewers like you. So it is my pleasure now to introduce the panelists for our first conversation. Eric Marsh is WHYY's community outreach organizer. He oversees the day-to-day of the News and Information Community Exchange. Ayinde Merrill is the president of Watu Moja. Reet Starwind is the creative director of Watu Moja. Tennyson Coleman is the race and culture reporter at NJ.com, and Miguel Martinez-Valle, the reporter at NBC 10 and Telemundo. Welcome to you all. I want to start with the organizers on this panel, Reet, Ayinde, and Eric. A 2020 Gallup poll showed that only 60% of the American public don't have much trust in the media. As organizers whose work is rooted in building trust with communities, can you share some best practices in trust building that journalists can learn from? Reet, let's start with you.
All right, cool. Just to reiterate, thanks for having me. And the best practice for trust building is just to be genuine and to be clear with your intentions. At the end of the day, you will yield trust if you have rightfully presented yourself as somebody who is trustworthy. It's like if you're a person who shows up and you're asking, oh, what can I do to get you to trust me? You're going about it the wrong way.
That's fair. Eric, you are working with the News and Information Community Exchange. These were people in the community who are already producing content, who has the trust of their neighbors. And we, for many of us, we went out them and engaged them as strangers. What are you doing to build trust? What are the best practices you can share that our newsroom can learn from, that Tennyson's newsroom can learn from, that Miguel's newsroom can learn from?
Well, I think one of the first things is to offer help and ask how you can be of assistance to them before you ask anything of them, right? So many times communities are used to individuals and specifically journalists coming in from outside and asking the community to give up something. They're asking for information, they're asking for sources, they're asking for, personal stories that are often triggering and traumatizing. And so my belief is that you first step into a community and offer something, whether it's assistance or whatever that might be that the community needs, and establish trust from a giving perspective rather than a taking perspective.
Mr. President, what would you say?
I think journalists need to come into the community with a mutual regard for the people that they're writing about. Far too often in traumatized spaces like Camden, journalists come in and almost act as pimps. They're pimping the trauma and they're leaving the person they interviewed empty while they're leaving with something that they'll put into an article. And once that happens over and over again, it becomes kind of community-wide a notion that you don't trust journalists. That's happened to me. That's happened to Reet, being misquoted and not taking the time to really come in and having that regard for the people that you're interviewing and getting to know them and to enter in a dialogue. And I think the biggest thing that journalists can do to build trust is come in open and don't come in with an angle for a story and ask questions that narrows down a response to your question, and to be open and to change your angle depending on what you hear in the conversations you have with the community that you're engaging with.
Thank you for that. Mr. President, I've been in this business for at least a decade, and I've heard journalists referred to as a lot of things. I've never heard them referred to as pimps. Thank you for that commentary. Miguel and Tennyson, I want to give you a chance to respond to what you've heard, and then I have some specific questions for you. Miguel, you first. Just your reaction to what you just heard from our organizers.
That makes a lot of sense. From very early on, like when I first started working in journalism, I felt it was a lot easier for everyone involved if you just approached it with humanity and a lot of empathy and kindness. So you're going in and you're meeting people a lot of the times at like the worst moment in their life. And so it is you have to be very human about that, and you have to go in, or at least I try to go in, with first, are you okay? How are you doing? How can I help you? If I have any information, a lot of the times, especially if it's, a fire or some kind of that emergency, people are very disoriented and they do have questions. So if I can guide them, in the right direction of like, oh, here's who you want to speak to. There's this police officer over there. They might be able to help you. Then that already opens up a dialogue, and it comes from a place of mutual respect. It comes from a place of both of us, being very human to each other instead of an exploitation of trauma, which is never what I want to do. I want to tell the community story. I don't want to take that story from the community for, it's not like trauma. That's not what we're trying to show.
Tennyson, I'm coming to you in just 1 second. Quick follow-up, Miguel. One of the things, I was in the Clubhouse chat room a couple of weeks back, and I'm part of this TV journalist Clubhouse thing that they do. And one of the journalists, I think in Florida, was talking about how when he goes into a neighborhood, into a scene when there's been a fire or a police killing, that it can be very off-putting to walk up to people with the camera already up on the shoulders and out, as if you're already expecting people to be on. And so what they do is kind of walk and they have the camera set down and ask the people, do you mind if we put the camera up? Are you comfortable? Is that something you've ever done or have considered doing? Does that make sense to you?
That makes sense. My team and I do, obviously, we get to the scene, and it's not that we have the camera off. If the crime tape is over, we try to give people space is our big thing. If I see a group of people and they're from that community, they're congregating, they're in an area, I see people crying and things like that, the last thing I want to do is be right next to them, being in their space. That doesn't create a pleasant environment for anyone. If I want to speak to someone, I usually tell my photographer, like, hey, just chill here for a little bit. I hand them the mic, because I don't want them to think that I'm secretly recording. I don't want them to think that I'm, just already invading their space. And usually, I introduce myself. I'm Miguel. I'm with NBC 10, Telemundo 62, depending on what language, we're speaking, and say, how are you doing? How can I help? Is there anything I can do? If you or anyone, want to say something, if you have a message you want to get out, if you have something to ask from the community, we're going to be over there, or, let us know. We're over here if you need us, or if you feel comfortable. And then a lot of the times I've had family members come up to us later or send someone. It's literally just say, we're not ready to talk right now. Maybe in an hour or two, we'll send someone to give a family statement. Because a lot of the times people do want information about their loved one or about the situation that they're living to get out. They have a message for the public. It's just obviously when you're going at them strong with the camera and face, they want a second to collect themselves. They want a second to live those raw emotions before, sending someone over to speak.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Tennyson, we'll give you a chance to respond to everything you've heard so far and offer your insight.
Sure, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Awesome. I really don't need to say anything. I think the organizers said it perfectly. I want to tell a story about something that has happened to me. I used to be a TV reporter as well. And because, a lot of times the employees, right, the journalists are going out with the mandate, right? Go get this, go do these things. I won't say the company or who I worked for in the past, but I had an experience where we talk about pimping out people, right? Especially poverty pimping, where we showed up, all the news stations showed up to a location that the mayor in the town, who gave a vague description of why we needed to be there, but it sounded like something that had to do with crime or something like that. And we get there and it's really just, we're in one of the poorest parts of the city that we were in, and the mayor is on someone's property saying, we're going to every single neighborhood in this city to to talk about blight. We're going to talk about blight, and specifically the property we were on. Someone had a mattress in their backyard. So they're here with all these news cameras in one of the poorer parts of the city, with all the cameras spotlighting this person's home, and you have a public works officer there, you know, and this woman comes outside, and she has kids because I saw tricycles in the front, and she comes outside just kind of trying to see what all the commotion is. She really didn't know why anyone was there. They didn't even tell her we were coming, and you know, all the cameras just rush over to her, you know, without any second thought. And you have this, you know, the mayor in the city saying, we're fining you $250 because you have a mattress in your backyard. And you know, she's coming outside to see what's going on, not necessarily to give a statement about whatever is going on, right? And we're talking about everyday people. And I just felt it was wrong I told the station I work for, I'm gonna blur her face out, because I think like that's just how I felt ethically about that situation.
Yeah.
And a few, you know, the other stations went on before us, and they had her name and they had her face. And so the directive to me was, well, you know what, we've thought about it. Everyone else did it, so you should do it. And for me, I didn't listen. They went home and I did what I did, and I still did. But the point is, we're talking about building trust, and we're talking about actually, you know, especially people who are working, people who, you know, may not have the resources, and we're just out here putting people on blast when we don't really know their situation. Yeah. And we feel like we're entitled to that because we have a camera and we have a platform. And for me, it goes back to treat people how you want to be treated in that situation, period.
Thank you for that.
You know what I mean? So that's kind of, you know, the organizer said, it sounds like common sense, but we have to sit here and talk about it in 2021.
Yeah, I want to bring everybody together on this conversation piece. Let's have a conversation about this in particular, and this is also coming from one of our viewers. I'm also getting people in the chats and the viewers who said this is the closest they even come in contact with a journalist, and this was part of why we wanted to do this summit. Is most adults have never even met a journalist. But I wanted to center this around something Councilor Nelson said in the prior segment, something that I've heard, you know, you, Mr. Coleman, mentioned to me in our conversations off the record, is that journalists tend to go into neighborhoods with a narrative already written. The story is done. They're not going in to explore what the story really is and what the neighbors think the story is. They've determined what the story is, and they just need a soundbite to complete that. Does that damage? I mean, is that counterproductive in the trust building context? Eric, I'll start with you.
Oh, it absolutely is damaging. I mean, it's damaging for trust in any relationship, right? It doesn't just apply to reporters and journalists. If you come with preconceived notions, that's what prejudice is, right? To have this preconceived idea of a person or a place or an event or a community, and you come in, first of all, it's bad journalism, and that you already come in with a story. So it's going to shape the questions that you ask, right? You're going to ask questions in a way, not necessarily to counter what you believe, but to confirm what you believe. So I think it's bad practice from a journalism standpoint. But from a trust building standpoint, it's absolutely the antithesis of what you need to be doing in order to build trust. One of the things that I share all the time in doing this new work of connecting community and community engagement to journalism is understanding that at the root of what we're doing is we're sharing people's stories. It's really about sharing individual stories and their experiences. And so if you are trying to do that as a journalist, then you can't come in with preconceived notions or ideas. And I think it just harkens back to the old way of doing business where journalists are often chasing a lead or trying to beat a deadline. Right. And so when you're up against those kind of parameters, it's only going to create more conflict and more friction. And I believe what's traditionally happened is like journalists have come into communities with almost sociological, anthropological viewpoint, right? Where they're going to study the community. And the community knows this, individuals know this. It happens on an individual, person to person, interpersonal relationship, and it happens on a community-wide level. And I think it's bad business and we need to do away with it.
Yeah, who wants to jump in? Just respond.
Yeah, I had that written down, when I was thinking about the things I wanted to talk about today. And that was something that Gary Nelson even mentioned earlier is, coming in with the narrative already planned out, you go into it, right, with ideas of what people may talk about. But, I've started to, especially in communities of color, and especially as we've come out of all of these news organizations and these corporations across industry saying they're listening to Black people, I'm just saying, here's the mic. What do you want to talk about? Even if I'm showing up at an event for something, what do you want to talk about? And that's where I start, because I've actually been having these conversations in the community, because I sometimes feel as though, we can be all journalists can be put into the same bubble of these practices, right? So I've just, I've tried to, first, I'm out at stories asking people, do they trust us? Do they trust the media? And if they don't, why not? I'm asking those questions before I'm asking anything else. Because I want to get a feel for how to do my job better. And I want to make sure that I'm listening, and I want to make sure that I'm being genuine, as people have mentioned. I also want to talk about, grassroots community engagement. I've tried to talk to some of these companies about, you can't just be reading comments on a Facebook post, or you can't just be reading analytics and lumping actual human beings into a narrative. Are you showing up? Are you hosting events for the community that aren't just, for the purpose of telling a story and saying, hey, look at what we're doing for you. Trust us. Are you there on your days off, not just when you're getting paid? Because that's when people really are going to tell you what they want to tell you, right? Everyone is not, especially if it's breaking news or spot news, you're catching people in a moment. And especially with what I cover, race, culture, identity, these are things that are nuanced and that people think about every day. And we can't keep approaching stories especially about communities of color, as look at, these are new things that people are talking about, right? When we're talking about social justice, for example, talking about representation, talking about trust building media, no, people aren't just starting to talk about that in 2021. And we have to look at ourselves and say, what have we historically done to be complicit, not just in racism, but also complicit in the fact that people don't trust us, right? I mean, I think we really need to talk about and be transparent about, what these media organizations have done to damage their reputation. And it needs to be out in the open, not all of this hush-hush stuff like that.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Mr. President and Reed, I'm coming to you guys in a second. But Miguel, what Mr. Coleman just said about sometimes going into the community on your day off, the American Press Institute says one of the main ways that journalists can build trust with readers is just getting out of the newsroom and interacting with the communities they serve, and not necessarily going there because there's a story to be told, but going there because these are the people you serve. Is that something that you are able to do? Do you find that you have the room to create those types of relationships at NBC 10 and Telemundo? And the second part of that is, how do you feel about this idea of narratives already being written before you interact with communities?
Well, really quickly, I'll say the narrative one. Yeah, you should not have your story, plug in the sound bites before you get to the scene, because that's not a story. Or that's not that's not journalism. That's just, you know, you going into a journalism class and kind of taking this outline.
Reed, you know, the kind of work that you guys do, you and Mr. President, especially around the defund the police and police reform, I have found that the activists and organizers on the ground, and particularly in that work, are more distrustful of media than those who say are organizing around, let's say, you know, climate change. There seems to be, you know, a little bit more tension when it's rooted in police and race. Why is that? And has that been your experience where you guys have just not spoken to media who wanted to do interviews with you because you just were afraid that they were going to mess it up intentionally or unintentionally? Tell me a little bit about your experiences interacting with media in Camden and South Jersey.
So big thing for us last year, and unfortunately we're on the tragic 1-year anniversary of murder of George Floyd, was that following that there was a quote unquote protest in the city of Camden. And it was notorious because it had the police force right front and center alongside the citizens, and they held a sign and they marched through the city, and it ended up going viral. And everybody, because Camden has its reputations for one reason or another, but people outside of the city and outside the region were going like, whoa, Camden, this super dangerous place, is able to cooperate with police in their protests. But the problem was the people in the city ended up not really feeling it because it ended up being super hollow. I had this point earlier about tension, and it really just turned into like a precedent. We had some local politicians pop up and say, hey, we're going to do better. Here's a Mr. Softy truck, get a free cone on your way out. And that's what led me and Ayinde to doing our own demonstration after that, one that embodied the spirit of the city and like the energy and the rage that people were feeling from the incident that had happened. And it was just crazy to us because had we not stepped forward and did what we did to say what we had to say, that first message, that first image of how Camden responded to the incident would have been the only way people had seen it.
Mr. President, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I think, again, you're fighting against a broader narrative because of the system that we're going up against has tons of funding and has influence over certain media outlets that they can push their own narrative. So a lot of times when journalists come to us, even though they might be well-intentioned, their media outlet might have certain narratives and certain pressures from funders to actually get a story out in a certain light. So yes, there was many interviews that we declined, and we had to learn quickly of how to interact with the media. Like you said, a lot of adults have never had interactions with the media or journalists, and they don't know the protocol and kind of your rights when you're talking to the media. That you can say off the record and have a truthful conversation, but again, there was people in our protests who didn't know that everything you say to a journalist can end up into an article. So we had to do some education afterwards to say, hey guys, just know if you're talking to a journalist, unless you say this is off the record, it's probably going to end up somewhere. And I think I know this isn't the journalist's job, but it would have been helpful if journalists can actually tell people who have no experience with a journalist kind of the protocol that they go through. But it was definitely taxing on us. And even when WHYY reached out with Becca Haydu, who did an amazing job, we had ignored that email for a few weeks until, but she was very persistent and she did an amazing job. And like we said before, she came in differently. She came in and she broke bread with us. We ate some food, we talked, we laughed, we did art together, and it reflected in the work that she produced. So if she has not yet gotten a raise, I am vouching that she gets a raise because she does amazing work.
You know, it was a reason I wanted you two on the on this panel was because I knew that was your experience with you know, WHYY. I think even when we were reaching out about the spoken word event, they was like, well, who was these people? So you know,
yeah.
You guys had some lived experience that I thought was
great too. So
yeah.
And again, you know, Dr. Dean, she keeps in contact with us, and it's not just using, because our medium of protest and awareness is through art. So when Dr. Dean reached out, she is just as invested in the art as she is the artist. And far too often, people value the art and discard the artist. So we appreciate WHYY for all that you've done and being actually part of our community and taking the time to learn about who we are and what we want. So thank you.
No shout out for a raise for Dr. Dean. Don't leave her out.
Yeah, Dr. Dean.
Tennyson and Eric, I want to bring you guys into this conversation because there was something that Ayinde said that I thought was interesting about education. That we're, as organizers, you guys are educating your comrades on this is how you interact with the media. This is what you need to say off the record. But I wonder about the value in people like Reed and Mr. President actually coming in and hosting trainings with journalists on how to build trust. Like that concept kind of flips the power dynamic on its head, but it could be really beneficial because who else could teach journalists how to build trust except the ones who are relatively distrustful? I mean, what do you think about that concept? You, Eric, and then you, Mr. Coleman.
Yeah, no, I think not only do I think it's valuable, it's something that we've built into NICE in our professional, quote unquote, professional development discussions, right? Is we're flipping this definition or the idea of what constitutes a professional on its head. And so what we do is every other week, we bring someone in to talk to the group of community partners and content creators about an area of expertise that they might have or an area of challenge that the partners are facing. And several times over the course of the past few months, the partners themselves have actually led these discussions, right? Because we recognize that everyone has lived experience, and in that lived experience, that can, constitute a level of professionalism that they can then teach to others. And so, very similar to what the other panelists have shared, is that people with lived experiences, those who are closest to the problem, often closest to the solution, as the quote says. And so, yeah, I'm 100% behind this idea of, folks who are activists, community engagement personalities, just neighbors with decades of experience coming in and speaking to these institutions, these legacy institutions, journalists, about the right way to go about covering these communities.
Mr. Coleman, and we're grateful to have Miguel Martinez back. We'll catch him up in just a second. Welcome back, sir. Mr. Coleman, what do you think about that concept of bringing in neighbors to hold trainings with journalists on how to build trust? And that's a question I'll also toss to Miguel now that he's back. Go ahead, Mr. Coleman.
Chris, you brought up a good point about the power dynamic, and I want to speak about that because I know myself as a journalist that I am in a position with some sort of power just by proxy of the platform. But I still think, I'm still a Black man in America, so there's privilege there that I may not have that other folks in the room may have, but I still understand the power that I have, and I take that responsibility seriously. And when we're talking about building trust, we have to remember that we are actually working for the people, right? So, I work at a corporation, not for one, I say that, right? So I think that is a great idea because at the end of the day, we are supposed to be working as you have mentioned, right? Collaborating with the community to tell its stories. And how can we do that if we aren't being receptive to criticism? We aren't being receptive to what folks really want us to be doing. And how can we be doing that if we're not showing up? Not just journalists, because I think journalists, the staff, a lot of folks get into this business because they want to do a public service. And so, hats off to all the journalists who are out there really boots on the ground, but we've also got to talk about the top, the people who are making the decisions. Those are the folks that really need to be leading town halls and events like this. And I commend WHYY for an event like this. I mean, I think it's groundbreaking to even have this conversation.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. Miguel, I want to bring you into it. We got on this thread because, Ayinde talked about how he educates his comrades in his constituency on how to interact with the media, particularly those who've never interacted before, when to say, this is off the record. But, they also talked about as a coalition how distrustful they were on the media because of their lived experience and maybe, how the media manipulated images to fit a certain narrative. And so we kind of started thinking about trainings and tossing it on the head. And what if Neighbors came into the newsroom to teach trainings on trust building? Would you, as a reporter, be welcoming of that? And what do you think what do you think of the concept overall?
I love it. I would be more than welcoming of it. And also, there are several organizations we're lucky in our region, like National Association of Hispanic Journalists, which I'm a part of. Joyce Soto's a part of as well, and Vanessa, who spoke earlier, she's on the board as well. And so, our organization, we look for training opportunities like that for our journalists who are out in the streets, but are also maybe producing some of them, the newscasts. And it's with those trainings, with those interactions, that we can really talk about the way that we are highlighting stories. This was a big conversation, an ongoing conversation that we had with our group in our group chat last summer, right? With a lot of the protests and a lot of the movement that was happening last summer. We wanted to be able that we were talking about it responsibly, that we were, making sure that when we were reporting, if there was, overnight looting, which was the headline everywhere, that we were not just talking about that we were talking about it in a greater context, that we were trying to bring in, a lot of the history of, why there's anger, why there's things happening that we were seeing all in our region. And so with these conversations, with these trainings, I think it's a good opportunity to give journalists tools that, unfortunately, sometimes journalism school just doesn't give you enough. They give you an outline, then you go out there and you're like, I'm kind of, I have these skills, I need more. And that's where I think some of these community team ups can really be super beneficial for everyone.
I think, Reet and Ayinde, are we at the point now, if I could send an email, I think, and it'll get responded in a timely manner, so.
Yeah, we have your email favored, so.
Oh, thank you.
It pops right up.
I want to close this conversation up with one more conversation point. I want to give each of you a chance to respond and think about this. When we talk about trust building in the context of Neighbors and Newsroom, it can be presented sometimes as one-sided in the sense that the journalist has to build trust with the community for this relationship to work. But we also know that community members also want to be sources for journalists and can be sources for journalism. So what's the responsibility of the public to prove that they're trustworthy and reliable to the newsroom? Anybody wants to take that first?
Yeah, I'll jump on that.
Okay.
And I'll say, the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is something I referred to earlier about lived experience. Is the community member or community person knowledgeable on the subject? There's always been this classic theme of, reporters going into the community and finding somebody to talk to, and they find the most hood person to talk to, right? And it doesn't reflect accurately of the residents. And so I think it's important for community members who have something to share, who can share it in a way that transmits the information accurately and in a way that can be consumed or digested by the audience, to really make sure that they're doing that and they're the ones who step up for the opportunity to speak. We already know, and we've all kind of zoomed out over the past year, and we've seen enough panels where we know individuals, and I've been guilty of this, individuals who maybe like to hear themselves speak a little too much, right? And so we want to be able to shift that to individuals with real life lived experiences who can transmit the information that's going to be reflective of the community. So for me, yes, a community absolutely has a level of responsibility in this. It's a partnership. It's a relationship.
Thank you for that.
And it's the only way we can really address that infrastructure. So
thank you.
And I can jump in real quick.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Miguel.
I was going to say, and it is, this trust building, it is, a conversation. So it happens both ways. The more I interact with you, the more I'm going to trust you too, right? If okay, I'm pretty, I have my cards. So if I'm in a community and I remember to have my cards, I'm pretty quick about handing them out. If, this story is today, but if you have something that you need down the road, and I'll have people send me things and we'll text, we'll call, and a few of them have panned out to be really, powerful stories, powerful pieces. And so it happens because we're having conversations, because, if they call me with a problem, even if it's not my beat, even if it's not the story I'm on that day, I can at least give them resources on where to go. At the same time, then, if I'm in the neighborhood again, I can remember and say, oh, I talked to this person who was the block captain. So, she had a little bit more access. She might know to point me in the right direction for the story that I'm telling today. And so I think it's two-way street. And I love doing that. I love going to communities, making these relationships, because then they know they can come to me. And also I know I can go to them.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, I think there's two things that I want to touch on. There's one is, as an organizer in the community, is being honest with yourself and understanding it's not about you, and it's not just to have your name in an article. So if a journalist comes to me and I'm not well informed on that topic, I can either do two things and say I'm not the right person to talk to about that, or if I can help that journalist, I can pass them along to someone who's really knowledgeable about that topic. The second thing is also, in Camden specifically, usually when there's a article done about Camden, they go to about the same 5 people for comments. And sometimes, because those people are of the community, doesn't mean they're for the community. And as organizers, we have to be very proactive in letting journalists know, either through email or text, or whichever medium that we have at our disposal, is to let the journalists know, maybe you should get someone else to speak for the community rather than the 5 people that are usually highlighted.
Thank you for that.
With my response here, if I can go.
Absolutely, go ahead, Reed.
Yeah, just to about the entire dynamic between journalists and the members of the community. Firstly, I'm a person who doesn't believe in career. I believe more in vocation. I know Tennyson had a point earlier about what does this whole thing look like without money attached to it, right? And, you go back to ancient times, there have always been people who are entrusted to take information and chronicle it, share it with people from far away. It's an important role in our culture. It's become so watered down because we have the shock value news that's supposed to scare the hell out of you first thing in the morning and right before you go to bed at night. But if our journalists can come in with that intention clearly in mind, the stories are there because the people in our community are out there doing work. I know Mr. President has on the t-shirt right now of Move Philly. And, this story is just now hitting national headlines. Or you have like Black Wall Street, which is getting more recognition nowadays. The stories are there. And you will find the stories that amplify the voices in need if you have the pure intention just to tell the story.
Thank you for that. Mr. Coleman, you get the last word.
I want to talk about, because your question was about how can the public,
prove that they're reliable and trustworthy.
Right. I would say, and someone mentioned this earlier, that they were training people on off the record and media terms. I want to advocate right now for media literacy. I want to talk about why we need to be teaching media literacy the same way we teach science, math, and everything else. There are, Google's free, right? So like, I think if people are saying they don't trust the media for a reason. And, but we should be also talking about, the theories, right? The research, the scholarly research that has been done on the media. Because a lot of times these outlets aren't going to report on themselves or report on these things, right? The medium is the message. That's Marshall McLuhan. These are important conversations to have. and is all out there. So I want to advocate for just educating yourself on media terms, media theory, media criticism, media analysis. You know, I mean, there are whole careers and academic, you know, diplomas for these things, and I don't think they're talked about as much, especially by the mainstream media, because again, it's almost counterproductive or counterintuitive to criticize yourself, right? But who is checking us? You know, I've had instances where I've had to go back and say, you know, apologize for things. You know, look, we're human, we make mistakes. But at the end of the day, I think the relationship there's a duality to it. And I think educating folks on how this all works and not trying to keep everything under wraps is the way to go.
Thank you for that. Eric Marsh, Community Outreach Organizer at WHYY. Mr. President, Ayinde Merrill, President of Watu Moja. Reet Starwind, Creative Director at Watu Moja. Tennyson Coleman, Race and Culture Reporter at NJ.com, and Miguel Martinez at NBC 10 and Telemundo. Thank you all for this important conversation.